June 13, 1944, in the small hours over the English Channel, a new sound arrives, an angry mechanical buzz like someone sawing metal in the sky. It isn't an airplane the way people know airplanes. No pilot, no radio chatter, just a tube with wings, a pulse jet thumping 10 times a second. And then, as quickly as it appears, the sound stops. A few heartbeats of silence, and London flashes orange on the horizon. That was the first V-1 attack. By the end of that summer, Britain would come to know them by one plain, clipped word: divers. It would also discover that stopping them was going to demand everything the island could muster: guns, balloons, radar, new tactics, and unexpectedly, the first Allied jet fighter. But that's getting ahead of the story. The V-1 flying bomb was a simple, terrifying idea: launch thousands of cheap, unmanned aircraft towards cities and let gravity and statistics do the rest. The numbers were brutal. Each one carried nearly a ton of explosive. They came fast, well over 350 miles an hour, low, small, and often in poor weather. At first, anti-aircraft guns struggled to hit them, and even the hottest piston fighters were working at the edge of their performance envelopes to catch them. Intercepting a V-1 wasn't like dueling another fighter. It was more like trying to tag a wasp with a dart while running full sprint downhill. So the Allies built a layered defense. Radar picked up the launches from across the channel. AA guns formed belts along the coast, fed by the new proximity fuses that could detonate near a fast-moving target. Barrage balloons tried to force the automaton bombs higher into those gun belts. And then there were the fighters: Tempests, Spitfire XIVs, late-model Mustangs, and Thunderbolts, screaming down from altitude, guns blazing. Some days it worked beautifully. Other days a few slipped through, and those few were enough to break roofs, bridges, families. By early July, the RAF had another card to play. It wasn't meant to be a V-1 killer. It wasn't meant to be anything in combat yet. But the times were desperate, and the Air Ministry decided to take the risk. Britain's first jet fighter, the Gloster Meteor, would go to war. On paper, the Meteor made sense. No propeller to bite into thin air at high speed. No torque. Clean lines. A promised top speed that suggested it could run with the new threat. But on the day it rolled out to its dispersal, it was still a very new machine. The engines were early Wellens, nervous, thirsty, each delivering thrust you could feel in your bones, but only for as long as the fuel lasted. The airplane wanted long runways, careful throttle hands, and plenty of maintenance. And into all that newness stepped the pilots of No. 616 Squadron. They'd flown Spitfires before, and they wore that quiet, slightly sideways humor of fighter pilots. Now they climbed into a cockpit that smelled not of hot oil but of hot kerosene. The controls felt steady. The sound, no familiar propeller note, was a turbine's whine that rose to a smooth, insistent roar. Taxiing was different. Takeoff was different. You didn't shove the throttle, you eased it, waited for the engines to spool, felt the acceleration arrive with a lag. Rotation was a gentle persuasion, not a yank. When they went operational in late July 1944, they were given a job that disappointed anybody who dreamed of meeting a German jet over France. They were told to defend Britain against the robot bombs, and that was it. No ranging into occupied Europe. No hunting Me-262s. Secrecy and caution ruled. If a Meteor went down in enemy territory, a German engineer might get to handle it. If a Meteor tangled with a 262 and lost, the propaganda damage would be immediate. So the new jets sat at forward fields like Manston in Kent, tucked under blast pens, ready to scramble on the code word diver. Picture one of those first scrambles, the scramble bell, running to the jet. Ladder away, canopy down, throttles forward, a heartbeat's pause, then more, the engines catching up, the thrust building, wheels up, the ground falls away. The controller's voice: Vector 210, Angels 2, Bandit heading northwest. The chase is different from any dogfight. Your eyes aren't scanning for a pilot's silhouette in a canopy. They're looking for a pencil-thin fuselage and a flicker of pulse fire from a pipe at the back. The radar controllers talk you in. The coastline angles across the windscreen. Somewhere ahead, over the Kentish orchards and hop fields, is a streak of metal. You see it first as a thread of heat shimmer, then a dark cross-section against cloud. It's small. Before you know it, your closure rate is hundreds of miles an hour. You jockey the throttle knowing the engines won't answer instantly. You line up, squeeze the trigger. Sometimes the cannons speak. Sometimes they don't. Early Meteors had teething troubles. Electrical gremlins, gun stoppages, ammo feed issues. And even when they worked, gunnery at those closure speeds was an art. Aim ahead, farther still. Fire too close and you risk flying through your own shrapnel cloud, or worse, the blast if you hit the warhead. Let it go too long and the bomb might quit in front of you. The engine stops when the fuel runs out, and then it falls and explodes under you. So RAF pilots resurrected a technique that sounds like a stunt and worked like science. Tipping, here's the idea. The V-1's autopilot kept it level with small gyros and its wings were designed to be stable. But if you flew alongside and carefully slid your wingtip just under its wing, almost touching, sometimes actually touching, the airflow over both wings changed. The V-1's wing dropped. The bomb rolled away. It wasn't a dramatic shove. It was more like pulling out the rug from underneath the air itself. The robot would wobble, its gyros confused, and then it would dive or cartwheel to Earth, hopefully into empty countryside or the sea. Several of 616 Squadron's first kills happened exactly that way. A meteor would close from behind, cannons jammed or ammunition gone, and the pilot would ease his jet until the metal skin on his wing whispered in the V-1's wake. A twitch, a roll, the bomb went down. Back in the dispersal after landing, ground crew would run their hands along the meteor's wingtip and find scuffs or a missing paint chip where metal might have met metal at 400 miles an hour. It sounded like a parlor trick, but it saved lives when gun solutions were tough. And for the Meteor, it played to the jet's strengths. The airplane carried speed well. It didn't suffer from propeller effects when you yanked the nose around low and fast. It had the raw sprint to catch the missile, and the stable handling to sit inches away without the prop wash of a piston engine battering the airflow. When the squadron's gunnery worked, and it increasingly did as the gremlins were chased out, pilots learned to aim from the rear quarter, fire short bursts, and then brake hard left or right to avoid the debris. By the time summer turned to fall, the belts of guns along the coast had been reinforced, the radar chain refined, proximity fuses widely deployed. Fighter pilots refined their own methods. Tempest pilots would dive from a slight altitude advantage, shoot, and then climb to come around again. Mosquito night fighters learned to find V-1s in the dark and ease into firing positions with radar guiding them in. Meteors added their own tally. At least a dozen V-1s confirmed destroyed, some by cannon, some by tipping. Not an enormous number compared to the total shot down, but everyone was a house spared, a street left standing, a set of names that didn't get carved into a memorial wall. If all you knew about the Gloster Meteor was this chapter, silver jets sliding alongside buzz bombs under a gray British sky, it would already be a worthy story. But it also sets up a bigger question that readers of history are always tempted to ask. If the Meteor was in service in 1944, and the Germans had Me-262s flying by then too, why didn't we get the showdown the rumors promised? Why weren't there contrails crossing over the Rhine with two jets and a high-G scissors? The short, frustrating answer: because the people in charge had a war to win, not a duel to stage. Start with secrecy. The British were acutely aware that the jet was their lead in a technology race. The Welland engines in those early Meteors were precious, hand-built, one at a time, with a lot of tricks in the metallurgy and bearings. The Allies were already collecting every German advanced weapon they could. The Germans were doing the same whenever a crashed foreign aircraft fell into their hands. If a Meteor went down in occupied Europe, Wheels up in a muddy field or belly landed near a village, it would be an engineer's dream. Keep them home and that risk drops. Then there was reliability and range. Early jets were thirsty. Run at high power for the sprint to catch a V1, climb, then dash again, and your fuel gauges moved like clock hands. The Meteor's endurance in those first months could be measured in a small number of tens of minutes, not hours. Sending a small number of brand new jets all the way across the channel to loiter with bomber formations, or to sit on alert at hastily built forward strips, just didn't make sense when the aircraft's maintenance needs were still being worked out, and performance comparisons weren't as simple as headline speeds. The Me-262 was faster, undeniably so, over 500 miles per hour in level flight when its engines cooperated. It could choose to engage or not, and at the end of a pass, it could simply light the burners, metaphorically, since early jets didn't have afterburners, and run. But the Meteor wasn't hopeless in a fight. It had a good rate of roll and friendly handling at medium speeds. Against a 262 forced to slow down, say, over a field or when maneuvering heavily, the Meteor could turn inside it. That's not speculation. Post-war trials with captured 262s and Meteors on the same day showed just that. The German jet had the sprint and climb, the British jet the steadier manners when things got tight. Still, if your job was to husband scarce machines and win the air war economically, you didn't throw your slower jet into a place where the enemy could dictate the terms. Finally, there was simple practicality. By late 1944, the Allies dominated the skies over Europe with swarms of P-51s and P-47s up high and Tempests down low. The Me-262s were dangerous during their fast passes, but the takeoff and landing phases were their Achilles heel, and Allied pilots learned to lurk near 262 airfields, pouncing when the German jets were most vulnerable. What problem, exactly, would a handful of Meteors solve on that battlefield that wasn't already being solved by hundreds of prop-driven fighters? That was the calculus that kept the Meteor in Britain. So the jet war many expected never materialized. Instead, the Meteor's war that year was one of sprints against drones. That war had its own flavor, its own rhythm, and its own stories. There's the pilot who came back with a grin because he just learned the trick of throttle anticipation. You think in propeller time, move the lever, feel the engine answer. With a jet, you start the move before you think you need it. Roll out behind the V1, add power gently seconds earlier, and by the time your nose steadies, the thrust arrives. That insight made the difference between coming up short and settling into the perfect firing distance. There are the little vignettes that never show up in aircraft spec sheets. A ground crewman wiping soot from the whitewash on a Meteor's tailplane and laughing at the smell that clung to his hands. A pilot stepping off the wing, ears ringing in a new way, not from the bark of exhaust stacks but from a constant, penetrating turbine moan. Controllers smoking in a dark room as the blips crawl past on a green screen, the flow of information and oxygen equal in its necessity. Some days were busy. Others were long, cold hours listening to a radio that stayed quiet. The V-1 offensive rose and fell with German plans and Allied advances. As British and Canadian armies rolled up the launch sites in northern France, the number of missiles launched from the ground fell. But then came a second phase. Air-launched V-1s slung under Heinkel bombers and dropped over the North Sea, aimed at cities still within range. At night, the Mosquitoes did much of the hunting. By day, fighters got what they could. Meteors kept flying. And then, as the winter of 1944 turned to 1945, the Meteor grew up. The F.3 variant arrived with better engines and longer range. Pilots got more hours. The maintenance side learned which parts needed to be replaced before they failed. There were conversations at high levels about sending Meteors across to the continent. Eventually, they did go, carefully, to well-established airfields, with rules that kept them from roaming too far. They flew patrols, stood alerts, even made a few fighter sweeps. Real, honest-to-goodness dogfights remained elusive. The German jets were scarce, their sorties short, and their pilots increasingly short on fuel, training, and luck. There were encounters, though. A Meteor might spot a small liaison aircraft and chase it down, an unglamorous kill that would nevertheless brand the aircraft in the logbook forever. First jet victory over a manned aircraft. Ground attack sorties crept into the schedule as the front moved. The Meteor's stable gun platform and decent low-level performance making it a useful tool when weather grounded other types. But the big meeting, the headline clash with the Me-262, never came before the war in Europe ended. That absence bothered some people then and now. History loves symmetry, loves the idea of the two firsts, first Allied jet, first operational German jet, testing each other on even terms. But when you look at what the Meteor actually accomplished in 1944, the story has a different kind of satisfaction to it. The Allies found a practical, urgent job for a brand new technology and used it with discipline. They prevented casualties. They kept secrets. They bought time for their own pilots to learn a new way of flying, and learning was the real currency in those months. Jets changed the workload in the cockpit. A pilot accustomed to listening to an engine to judge what it was doing had to learn to watch the gauges instead. Engine management was crucial. Slam the throttle open at low speed, and you might get a flameout when the compressor stalled. The fire in the combustion chamber snuffed. Throttle back, nurse it. Let the engine breathe. The Meteor taught this gently, in a way the Me-262's more temperamental engines did not. The German machine punished ham-handedness with shattered compressor blades and fires. The British machine nagged you with warnings and roughness, but usually lived to fly another day. That difference mattered when your pilot corps needed to build hours, not lose them. To this day, pilot reports from those early Meteors have a warmth. They talk about pleasant control forces, good visibility, a lack of torque that made gunnery steadier, and the peculiar satisfaction of having a throttle that didn't fight you when you were lining up a shot. They also grumble about range, about the short endurance that ended sorties just when you felt you had the measure of the machine. They remember the smell of hot fuel and the way the engine spooled like a train starting, not like a car leaping. As the war ended, the RAF gathered captured German jets, ran them against Meteors, and the comparisons confirmed what wartime instincts had already suggested. The Meteor was not the fastest, but it was forgiving. It was a better stepping stone to the truly modern fighters that would come in the next 5 years. The swept wings, the pressurized cockpits, the radar in the nose. The Me-262 was a bold, raw leap with sharp edges. The Meteor was a platform on which to build an air force that could move from the piston age to the jet era without breaking. That path leads directly to the Meteor F.8, a very different animal from the stubby F.1s that chased V1s across Kent. Longer fuselage, better engines, better systems, better everything. When the Korean War came, Meteors flew again, this time with the Royal Australian Air Force, finding that straight-winged 1940s jets had a hard time against the new swept-wing MiG-15s. The lessons from that war, too, trace back to the decisions made in 1944. What you ask a jet to do, how you pair it with the right mission, when you accept or refuse a fight based on performance envelopes. All of that flows from a summer when Britain's first jet fighter launched not to duel another pilot, but to outwit a flying bomb. If you stand today near the old hardstands at Manston, just grass and concrete and the wind, you can still feel the scale of the enterprise that made those scrambles possible. It started with a drawing board in an office where Frank Whittle's early ideas were treated as curiosities, not foundations. It moved through machine shops that figured out how to keep metal from tearing itself apart at 700 degrees Celsius, through test pilots who wrote calm paragraphs about flames licking the sides of prototype nacelles, through squadron leaders who told their pilots to memorize a new emergency checklist, through controllers at fighter command who rewrote their traffic patterns for a machine that couldn't loiter like a Spitfire could. Then one day, a pilot strapped in, looked down the runway at a white chalk line and engine heat haze, and pushed those levers forward. That first run down the runway wasn't a duel with a 262. It was a race with the future. The victory lap would come not with streamers and armorers painting swastikas under the cockpit, but with an almost invisible nudge of a wingtip, and the relief of hearing no explosion where a city should be. There's an image, repeated in many memoirs, of a meteor flying formation with a V1 for a few seconds, just long enough for the pilot to pick his moment. Two machines of the new age, side by side, neither one really meant for a turning dogfight. One was a blunt instrument. The other was a scalpel learning how to cut. When the meteor eased its wing under that of the robot, the world held its breath for a heartbeat. Then physics happened quietly. The bomb rolled away, found the ground, and turned itself into a crater in a field instead of a crater in a street. The meteor flashed past and climbed, the pilot's eyes on the fuel gauges, mind already mapping the route back to base. For historians, the phrase, "the jet war that never happened," is a clever line. But the war that did happen, the one where the first Allied jet fought drones, wasn't an absence. It was an achievement. It was the transition of a brand new technology from prototypes with burned paint to a serviceable tool flown by squadron pilots, with deadlines and sleep schedules and favorite mugs. It was the proof that you could take a nation's curiosity and turn it into an advantage without squandering it for spectacle. In the end, the meteor didn't need to meet the Me-262 to matter. It needed to be in the right place when the sirens started, and the new kind of enemy flew low and fast across the countryside. It needed to be simple enough to keep in the air, safe enough to return when the engines coughed, and fast enough to catch a bomb that wasn't waiting around to be shot at. It did all that. The war ended, the meteors got gloss paint and new engines, and the world moved on. But for a few months in 1944, Britain's first jet lived at the edge of what people thought airplanes could do, and it did its real work not by chasing glory but by cutting the casualty list. That's not the story the posters promise. It's better. So the next time you see a photograph of a meteor on a strip of concrete in black and white, think of the humming engines, the quick hands on the throttle, the pilot's eyes measuring distance and time, and a machine built for a duel sliding up on the shoulder of a weapon with no pilot. The showdown we didn't get between jets is a curiosity. The partnership we did get, between jet and radar, between pilot and controller, between new machine and new mission, is the reason that many people who would have been statistics on a bombing report lived to tell their stories instead. That's the jet war that never happened, and the one that actually did.